Is the sound projecting to the back? Okay. Okay, I'm going to stand so everybody can see me. Okay, so welcome to this class on, I call it the Introduction to Buddhism. And so why are we having this Introduction to Buddhism? Okay, I've been living here at this monastery since 2007, and I've been giving regularly on Saturdays a class on the suttas, on the Buddha's discourses. And the class has continued now for about 10, 11 years. And yet it struck me that we don't have a course that provides people with a foothold in Buddhism, with an introduction to Buddhism. And so I decided to start this very concise class of 6 sessions to provide an introduction or a foothold into Buddhism. And now when I use the word Buddhism, but actually Buddhism is a very vast phenomena, including many different schools, many different forms of belief, doctrines, worship, practices. But what I'm going to be focusing on is not Buddhism in its entirety, but rather what I would call the core or essential teachings of the Buddha. And the source that we rely on for the fundamental teachings of the Buddha is a set of texts that are called the Nikayas. Yeah, the word Nikaya means a collection, and these are collections of suttas. The word sutta is a discourse of the Buddha. And so the discourses of the Buddha were collected very shortly after his passing away, and collected and then incorporated into these collections called Nikayas. And there have been different transmissions of these early Buddhist discourses in different countries, in different languages. But we have, fortunately, we have a version of the early Buddhist discourses preserved in a language which would be very close to the language that the Buddha himself spoke. Probably, as most of you would know, the Buddha lived and taught in northern India, somewhere around the 5th century BC. You know, scholars are divided about the exact years of his life, but it would be roughly from, say, 500 BC to 420 BC. And so the Buddha traveled over a large extent of northern India and probably used several of the dialects that were current during that period. We don't know exactly what kind of language the Buddha would have used, but it would have been a North Indian language, or several languages or dialects, which would have been derived from Vedic Sanskrit. That's the early form of Sanskrit. But as Sanskrit evolved, Vedic Sanskrit, it became incorporated into colloquial languages. And so the Buddha would have spoken these colloquial languages, and his discourses are now preserved in a language which is related to those North Indian languages, and that language is called Pali, P-A-L-I. Yeah, there are counterparts to these discourses preserved in Pali that had been transmitted to China during the early centuries when Buddhism moved from India to China and translated into Chinese. Later in India, the discourses were translated into the literary form of Sanskrit. Some have been preserved in Tibetan translation. And so we can compare these different versions of the discourses, and what we find, even though there are some differences in formulation and organization, but there's an astonishing amount of agreement among the different versions of these discourses. And so scholars have with a fair degree of certainty, have come to the conclusion that these discourses come as close as we can come to the actual discourses of the Buddha. The Buddha himself didn't write anything down, and in fact, writing was not used for religious texts in India during that period. But the way the teachings were transmitted was through oral discourse, the Buddha speaking, and his disciples, having listened to the discourse, would memorize the teachings. How is such feats of memory possible? One thing that I've noticed, I lived in Sri Lanka for many years, and what I've noticed is that growing up in a literate culture in which we depend upon written materials, books, and writing, decreases our capacity for memorization. And I've seen in Sri Lanka simple village people who are not dependent, they might be barely literate, but they can remember things with much greater detail and precision than I can remember with all of my experience in study and writing. And so the Buddha's disciples would have listened to the discourses, and they were probably organized into teams with the responsibility for remembering the discourses and then teaching them to their own students. And in this way, the teachings had been passed on from one generation of monks to the next generation. And shortly after the Buddha passed away, his foremost disciples met. It's said that 3 months or 6 months after his passing away, they met in a kind of conference, a large conference, and they compiled the discourses of the Buddha and arranged them into these collections. Okay, so I'm explaining this just to make clear what I'm going to be covering in this course. So I'm not trying to cover Buddhism in its entirety, but the fundamental teachings of the Buddha, the teachings that in greatest likelihood come from the Buddha himself. And these teachings are derived from these collections called Nikayas. And the individual discourses and the Nikayas are the suttas. Okay, so first, the word Buddha. The word Buddha is not a proper name, but it is an honorific title. And it's the title which is given to the historical founder of Buddhism. And the word Buddha comes from the verb bujati, which means to understand, to comprehend. And so the Buddha is one who has understood, who is comprehended, I would say, like the deepest truths of existence, and who makes known the path or way that leads to greater human happiness, inner peace, and ultimate liberation. And what the Buddha teaches is called, in the Pali language, is called the Dhamma. the word Dhamma in its sort of broadest meaning, I would define as the fundamental principle of truth and goodness. It's a principle in which, you could say, in which the nature of reality and the nature of good, of goodness, are merged. And so a person becomes a Buddha, a fully enlightened one, by realizing, by understanding, by comprehending the Dhamma in its totality, and then declaring the Dhamma to the world. And so you could say that the Dhamma is the fundamental truth about human life, human existence, or more broadly, the fundamental truth about all existence, the fundamental truth about reality, the real nature of things. And so the task or function of the Buddha, what makes him the enlightened one, is that he has realized, awakened to, comprehended the Dhamma in its totality, and then he teaches the Dhamma to the world. So the Buddha is not a savior in any way, somebody that one relies upon to do the work of salvation for oneself, but rather his role is to be that of a teacher. He is the one who teaches the Dhamma to reveal to us, to expose to us the fundamental nature of the reality of our own lives. So he teaches the fundamental reality of our own life and the path to be followed to achieve the ultimate good of human existence. And there's a certain passage that we come across often in the suttas, in the discourses, which in a way indicates which indicates the Buddha's role as a teacher. This is a stock passage when somebody has come to the Buddha and asked for a clarification of a particular point, and then the Buddha gives this person a discourse. And at the end of the discourse, the way the person expresses appreciation, he starts off by saying, "Excellent, excellent." And then he calls the Buddha the Blessed One. So he says, "The Blessed One has made the Dhamma clear in many ways, as though he were turning upright what had been overthrown, revealing what was hidden, showing the way to one who is lost, or holding up a lamp in the darkness, so those with good insight can see forms." So I see this passage as having a very, very deep significance. So first, it indicates the first line of praise, turning upright what was overthrown. Like our minds are usually, we would say, from the standpoint of the Buddha, the ordinary human mind is upside down and inside out. Like we don't understand things correctly, but we understand things and view things through certain distorting lenses. Or what happens is the mind manufactures, constructs mental constructions, and then projects them out into the world. And so we see things in terms of our mental projections. So we're seeing things not as they are, but upside down and inside out. And so when the Buddha teaches the Dhamma has the function of turning upright what was upside down. So our way of seeing things and understanding things now becomes corrected as our wisdom or insight arises, then we come to see things correctly rather than in these distorted ways. Again, the second phrase says that he reveals what was hidden. And what he's revealing is, as we'll see as we go on in the course, is the truth about our own life, the truth about our own nature, about our own existence. And our own existence, our own experience is closest to us, closer than anything else, since we are the actual experiencer. But the nature of our experience, the nature of our existence, is hidden from us, the real nature. And so the task of the Buddha is to reveal what was hidden, not as a divine revelation, but by explaining, clarifying, proclaiming, illustrating the nature of human existence. Okay, the third phrase says that he shows the way to one who is lost. And so in our ordinary lives, what we are basically seeking is happiness and freedom from suffering. And yet, because our minds are upside down and inside out, we tend to seek happiness, contentment, peace in the wrong places, along the wrong way. And so the task, in a sense, we're like people who are lost. We're looking for a particular place. Maybe we've come the first time to New York City, and we're looking for Brooklyn, and we don't know a particular place in Brooklyn. We don't know how to find Brooklyn. And so we take maybe our train takes us to Grand Central Station, and we go to the subway, and then we take the first train that comes along, going uptown to the Bronx. And so in a sense, the Buddha is the one who guides us to the subway map, or tells us which train to take to get to Brooklyn. And then the fourth phrase says that his teaching of the Dhamma, it's holding up a lamp in the darkness so that those with good eyesight can see forms. So in our ordinary life, we have that potential for wisdom, that is good eyesight, but most of the time we're moving about in a kind of spiritual darkness. And so the Buddha holds up the lamp. This is the lamp of the Dharma, so that we could use our potential wisdom, guided by the Dhamma, to see things as they really are. Just like a man in the dark room, when somebody brings a lamp into the dark room, then he can see visible forms. Okay, then I took another passage, again, which shows the function of the Buddha. Okay, so here we have the text says that whether Buddhas arise in the world or not, there persists that law, that stable principle. That stable principle is the Dhamma, that fixed nature of the Dhamma, and that is that all conditioned things are impermanent. I don't want to dwell on this principle right now of impermanence. That's one of the truths that the Buddha discovers. But what I want to focus on is the function of the Buddha. Here it says that a Buddha awakens to this and realizes it. So that's the first task of the Buddha, is to awaken to discover, to realize the nature of things. And then the second task is to explain the nature of things. So he explains it, proclaims it, analyzes it, elucidates it, and teaches that all conditioned things are impermanent, and so forth. Okay, so in the Dhamma itself, we actually have two aspects. One is principles. So these are the truths or principles that the Buddha discovers and makes known. And these are not like divine revelations or divine or sacred dogmas that have to be believed and accepted out of trust or out of faith. But these are the principles that the Buddha has discovered through his enlightenment and that are potentially available for anybody who follows his path to penetrate and to realize for themselves. Okay, so one aspect is that of principles. The other aspect is that of practices. So the Buddha lays special emphasis on undertaking the practices that will lead to benefits for oneself and for others. And so we have one statement, it's the very concise statement about, in a sense, the essence of Buddhist practices. This comes in a verse in a work called the Dhammapada. It's a collection of versified sayings of the Buddha, that not to do any evil, to cultivate the good, and to purify one's own mind. This is the instruction of the Buddhas. And so here we have actually the Buddha's whole training, in a sense, included within this short verse. So not to do any evil, like that is the starting point. And in other teachings, the Buddha will enumerate, sometimes in a lot of detail, the various kinds of evil or unwholesome deeds one might commit that have to be avoided. Then the second aspect is to cultivate the good, to cultivate good qualities and good actions that are the opposite of the evil actions. And then what's distinctive, so we could say that these two principles or practices, avoiding evil, cultivating the good, this is the aspect of morality or ethics, ethical behavior. And then purifying one's own mind refers especially to the practice of meditation. So we say the practice of meditation is the way to purify the mind. In a broader way, the practices the practice of the Buddha's teaching is often laid out in terms of three types of training. So there is training in moral conduct. And here, in terms of this verse, that would comprise both the aspect of avoiding evil or bad actions and cultivating the good, engaging in various types of good or wholesome actions. then the purifying of the mind, the initial stage is undertaken through the practice of meditation. Through the practice of meditation, we're developing qualities like mindfulness and mental clarity, calmness, and collecting the mind. Usually the mind is scattered and distracted, so we're training to collect and unify the mind. And then the third stage of Buddhist practice is the development of wisdom. So even meditation for Buddhism is not sufficient. Sometimes people think when they hear about Buddhism, they think Buddhism is completely entirely comprised within the practice of meditation. But in fact, the practice of Buddhism takes place in terms of these three aspects of training. At the very foundation is to lead an ethical life by observing the principles of right conduct. And then on the basis of right conduct, then one cultivates the mind in order to purify the distracting and disturbing thoughts, the disturbing, tumultuous tendencies of the mind. And then when the mind becomes calm, clear, and collected, then one could use that concentrated mind in order to investigate the nature of one's own experience. And that is the means for the development, for the arising of wisdom. Maybe I could take, if there are any questions just that come up at this point, before I go further. Okay, then let's go further. Okay, I've selected some text that will help us to understand some different aspects of the nature of the Buddha's teaching. And one aspect, which I alluded to before, is that it doesn't demand that one place blind belief in the teaching. There are certain principles that the Buddha teaches which are beyond the capacity of ordinary people to see for themselves. But the Buddha begins with things that we can observe for ourselves and see for ourselves and verify for ourselves. And one excellent example of this comes in a discourse that the Buddha gave to a group of people who were living in a certain town called Kesaputta. These people, their clan name was the Kalamas. And it's said that a number of spiritual teachers with different beliefs, different doctrines, had come to this town, and they had taught the people their own doctrines, promoting and praising their own doctrines, and tearing down the views of their opponents. And so the Kalamas, when the Buddha arrived in their town, the Kalamas came to him, and they said that they are perplexed and doubt about which of these teachers is speaking truth and which are speaking falsehood. Now these people, the Kalamas, they were not disciples of the Buddha. They were just, it was just the Buddha would go traveling from town to town and village to village, giving his teachings. And so when the Kalamas heard that the Buddha came, they knew that the Buddha had a good reputation. And so they came to him to ask for him to clarify the conflicting teachings of the other teachers. But in this situation, the Buddha didn't say, forget about the teachings of the others. I'm going to tell you the truth. You follow my teaching. But instead, if you could see, he says that it's fitting for you to be perplexed. It's fitting for you to be in doubt. Doubt has arisen about a perplexing matter. And then he said to the Kalamas, do not go by oral tradition, what's been passed down through one generation of teachers to another. Don't depend upon a lineage of teaching, by hearsay, by a collection of texts, by logic and inferential reasoning. Don't believe a teacher just because he's very eloquent, and very impressive. And don't even believe somebody just because you think that he is your teacher. The Buddha then says, when you know for yourselves these things are unwholesome, these things are blamable, these things are blamed by the wise, these things, if followed up, lead to harm and suffering, then you should abandon them. And then he used a common sense way of questioning. So he asked the Kalamas, what do you think when greed, hatred, and delusion arise in you? Does it lead to your welfare or to your harm? They say it leads to harm. Then the Buddha said, a person who is greedy, hating, and deluded, overpowered by greed, hatred, and delusion, motivated by these mental forces, will destroy life, steal the belongings of others, commit sexual misconduct, speak lies, and will also persuade others to act in the same way. So will that lead to his harm and suffering for a long time? And the answer is yes. And so, through argumentation or questioning, the Buddha gets the Kalamas, the people, to see that these things, greed, hatred, delusion, and the actions that flow from them are unwholesome, they're unethical, they're blameworthy, they're criticized by the wise, and if one acts upon them, they'll lead to one's harm and suffering. And then in the opposite way, the Buddha speaks about a person who is without greed, hatred, and delusion. So when the mind is free from greed, hatred, and delusion, does it lead to one's well-being or to one's harm? It leads to one's well-being. And a person without greed, hatred, and delusion will avoid taking life, stealing, sexual misconduct, and false speech, and persuade others to do likewise. And that will lead to their welfare and happiness for a long time. Okay, so from this we could see that the Buddha here is appealing to something that one could see and verify for oneself. And in a way, this is like the essence of his teaching, is to overcome and to eliminate greed, hatred, and delusion. These are what the Buddha calls the three unwholesome roots. They're the roots of all the other disturbing and distressing mental states. All arise and are rooted in greed, hatred, and delusion. And greed, hatred, and delusion, those are the underlying motives for all types of unwholesome action. And so the ultimate aim of the Buddha's teaching is to overcome and actually to eradicate, to eliminate greed, hatred, and delusion. Because those things, we could see, lead to unwholesome behavior. They bring harm to oneself, harm to others. And here, like without appealing to any kind of unverifiable doctrine, the Buddha just appeals to what you could see for yourself just by personal investigation. Of course, the Kalamas must have been rather intelligent people to understand, to understand this rather easily, since maybe nowadays if you go to certain groups of people and you say, is greed good or bad? They'll say, greed is good. And if somebody does commit some wrong to you, should you have hatred towards them or endure it patiently? And I'll say, it's okay to have hatred towards them and to commit violence against them. But if one reflects on the ultimate consequences of acting on greed and hatred, one could see that that is harmful. Okay, I took another sutta here, another discourse, in which the Buddha is in conversation with a young Brahmin. This young Brahmin has been challenging the Buddha, and then the Buddha replied to this young Brahmin until the young Brahmin became interested in the Buddha's teaching. And then the young Brahmin asked the Buddha how the discovery of truth takes place. And this is a very important aspect of the Buddha's teaching, because in Buddhism, the truth is something that we're supposed to realize for ourselves. The ultimate liberation for Buddhism, it doesn't come simply from believing the Buddha and accepting that the Buddha, you are the enlightened one, your teaching is true and wonderful and magnificent, but the truth is something that one has to realize for oneself. And so here, this young Brahmin asked the Buddha, how does this discovery of truth take place? And then the Buddha answers, he says, first, a seeker should go to somebody who's reputed to be a teacher and investigate that teacher, to observe his conduct, his way of life, his manner, his way of speaking, his teaching. And when he sees that the teacher's conduct is very virtuous and that the teacher shows good personal qualities and teaches in a very humble and honest way, then he gains faith in that teacher. He visits him and pays respect to him. Then after paying respect to him, because respect is important for opening the mind to receive spiritual teachings, then one listens to that teacher. And when one listens, then one hears the Dhamma, the teaching of that teacher. Then having heard the Dhamma, one retains it in mind and one examines the meaning of the teachings. You see, one is here progressing. Initially, one places faith or trust in the teacher, which doesn't mean that one surrenders blindly to the teacher, but it just means that one is willing to trust the teacher and open one's mind to that teacher's teaching. But when one hears the teaching, then one has to examine the meaning of those teachings, to investigate and see whether they can stand up under investigation. Okay, then when one examines the meaning of the teachings, then one is willing to accept those teachings as a result of that examination. Okay, then when one accepts the teachings, then there arises a desire to realize the truth. And when that desire arises, then one applies the will. Having applied the will, again one investigates the teaching, now at a deeper level. Then having examined the teaching, one strives, and then by striving, and this would apply to the development of deep insight meditation, then one personally realizes the supreme truth and sees it by penetrating it with wisdom. In this way, there is the discovery of truth. Okay, now when we speak about the discovery of truth, or the realization of truth, the Buddha is not speaking about like realizing objective facts about the world, the kind of facts that are given to us, by the physical sciences, the biological sciences. That kind of information you can get if you want to learn that truth about the world. You take courses in physics, biology, chemistry. But the truth that the Buddha is teaching is the truth about human existence, particularly those truths that will enable us to liberate ourselves from suffering. And so for this reason, the Buddha rejects as irrelevant. During the Buddha's time, there was a lot of discussion amongst the philosophers and religious teachers about various abstract philosophical questions. And the Buddha rejected, he refused to state any position on those speculative questions. And one time the Buddha had a monk disciple named Malankya-Putta who came to the Buddha and he said, all of the other spiritual teachers have been presenting their views about these philosophical questions, but you haven't said anything about them, and I'm not happy with that. You have to tell me what is your position on those questions, and if you don't tell me, I'm going to take off my robe and leave you. Then the Buddha replied to that monk with a very famous simile. It's the simile of the poisoned arrow. So he says, if anyone should say that I won't lead the spiritual life under the Blessed One, under the Buddha, until the Buddha tells me whether the world is eternal or not eternal, finite or infinite, whether the soul is the same as the body or different from the body, whether the enlightened one exists after death or doesn't exist after death, I'm not going to answer those questions. And that person would die before they get an answer from me. And then the Buddha he illustrates this with a simile. He gives a simile of a man who's been wounded by a poisoned arrow. And then his friends and relatives, they bring a surgeon to cure the man, to treat the man, to take out the arrow. And so when the surgeon comes, then the wounded man says, I won't let the surgeon pull out this arrow until I know the name and clan of the man who wounded me, until I know whether that man was tall, short, of middle height, whether he had a dark brown or golden skin complexion, until I know what material the bow and arrow were made from, and so forth. So if the man were to act like that, refusing to let the surgeon pull out the arrow, he would die. And so, the Buddha says, if anyone says, I won't lead the spiritual life under the Buddha until he answers those questions, I still won't answer those questions. And meanwhile, that person would die. And then the Buddha said that he doesn't declare answers to those questions because the answers are unbeneficial. They don't relate to the spiritual life. They don't lead to enlightenment and to liberation. And what the Buddha teaches, this is what he says. He teaches the nature of suffering, the origin or cause of suffering, liberation from suffering, and the way to liberation from suffering. Okay, maybe at this point I'll ask whether there are any questions. And please don't feel shy or hesitant to ask questions, because that is how you learn best. Do we have the, yeah, we do have the other microphone.
Okay, so you talked about the section when a seeker gains faith through a certain teacher, he visits him and he pays respect to him. And the reading was those teachings as a result of pondering them when he was accepted those teachings, a desire to realize the truth springs up. When that desire is sprung up, he applies his will.
Yeah.
So my question is, how do you do that?
Well, what's meant by applying one's will, that would imply like making a determined effort, particularly I think what's intended here is the development of insight in meditation. Like first collecting the mind through the practice of meditation, and then using that collected mind to investigate the nature of the body and mind. That is what we call the development of insight. You know, we're going to come into some of these matters as we go along with this program. I see, okay, somebody in the back.
Hi, thank you. My name is Merritt. And
your name is?
Merritt.
Merritt.
And
okay,
my question
Merit. We always speak about doing meritorious deeds.
Thank you, thank you. And my question is about the discovery of truth.
Yeah.
And I really enjoyed that. But one of the things that came into my mind was it seems like a lifelong process, that discovery of truth.
Oh, yes. The practice of Buddhism is certainly a lifelong practice, and we say that it's a practice that takes place over multiple lifetimes. Because as we see, Buddhism teaches the principle of rebirth, you know, so that our practice is not confined only to this life, but it goes on from life to life until we develop all of those qualities come together that are sufficient for the realization of the truth. But certainly in terms of any one lifetime, once one starts, if one hopes to realize the truth, one has to stay on the path through that course of that life. I'm not going to ask anybody to make a lifetime commitment in this class. Okay, please. And it's good to say your name, and I hope, my memory is not that good anymore, but I hope I could remember.
My name is Jennifer. And I was wondering if you could elaborate on the unwholesome root of delusion. Does that mean like willful ignorance?
It's pretty much the equivalent of what we would call, technically we would call that the same as ignorance, whether it's willful or unwillful. But it means not understanding the real nature of things, being confused about the real nature of things. And generally, when we come to the more technical aspects of the Buddha's teaching, it would be explained as taking what is impermanent to be permanent, taking what is not a true source of happiness to be a source of happiness, and then at the deepest level, it would be taking the components of the body and mind to be a true substantial self. I think this will become, it might not be so clear right now, but I'm going to come to this, I think, in the third or fourth class of the series. Okay, good.
Hi, my name is Shelley. When I want to explain Buddhism in a really simple way to my kids or friends that know nothing about it, I'm lost. Is there sort of a very brief way to describe it to people that know nothing about it?
Hopefully, at the end of this course, you'll have enough information to be able to describe it concisely. How old are your children?
In their 20s.
Oh, in their 20s. Okay, so they're adults. I would say, to put it very, very simply, it's understanding that there are, say, two fundamental aspirations of human life. One is to avoid suffering. The other is to find happiness. And I would say that there are causes that underlie suffering and causes that underlie the achievement of happiness. And so I say the essence of the Buddha's teaching, put very, very concisely, is discovering and understanding the causes of suffering in order to overcome those causes, to avoid them, to overcome them, and understanding the causes of happiness, the means to happiness, in order to cultivate and develop them. And thereby not only to avoid suffering for oneself and to achieve happiness for oneself, but also to enable one to avoid imposing suffering on others and being able to impart happiness to others. So to benefit oneself, to benefit one's others in the highest way. That's very concise. Okay, if we could take one more question, then we'll have a little break. Right up here, Venerable Mangala. Did you say your name, by the way?
Shelley.
Shelley, okay.
I'm Catherine.
Catherine.
Some people define Buddhism as a philosophy, and
Yeah.
some define it as a religion.
Okay.
And perhaps there's another that I don't know of.
Yeah.
But I was wondering what you
Yeah.
thought of that.
Okay. I don't like to try to pigeonhole Buddhism in one category or another. Certainly, let us say Buddhism as practiced, I'd say certainly is a religion in that it involves, well, anyway, this brings up the question, what is religion? Okay. Some years ago, I actually taught religion before I became a monk, world religions. And so in that class, I came up with 4 questions. What makes something a religion? So I said it gives an answer to the ultimate nature of the world or the universe, the ultimate nature of the human being, an answer to the question, what is the ultimate good of human life, and what is the means to achieve that ultimate good? So if you take those questions as the criteria for religion, I'd say Buddhism is a religion. Though if one takes religion to involve a belief in a creator God who creates the universe out of nothing and rules the universe and requires worship and veneration, then Buddhism lacks those features. In Buddhism, we believe in other realms of existence that are invisible to our ordinary eyes, in which living beings pass in the cycle of rebirth, but all of those realms are impermanent. Life in all of those realms is impermanent. So there's no permanent creator God in Buddhism. Yeah, and of course Buddhism also, because the teachings of the Buddha have a philosophical flavor, so out of the Buddha's teachings they've developed very complex and sophisticated systems of philosophy. And in the medieval period of Buddha's history, there are intense debates between the different philosophical schools. But the essence of Buddhism is not, you see, maybe the defining mark of philosophy is an attempt to understand the world just in conceptual terms. Whereas Buddhism, though it has philosophical principles, it doesn't stop with abstract philosophical principles, but those philosophical principles are guides to insight and understanding, and so guides to personal realization. Okay, I think we had scheduled like a little break, so if anybody has to use the restroom, there's one, actually there are two restrooms here for men and women, and then down the stairs and towards the door, there's another two restrooms for men and women. And then after this, then we'll come back, and then we have the practical section, where Venerable Mangala will give some basic instructions in meditation.
So Bhante, will be 5 minutes break or 10 minutes break?
I had scheduled a 10-minute break.
Okay, so everyone come back at 3:10?
Yeah.
Okay, all right.
And if